Hello and welcome. I am Beth Mashesky, Senior Scientific Specialist at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, which is part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. This webinar and all of the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars are certified green events through the University of Illinois Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. To find out more about certified green events through U of I, please visit sustainability.illinois.edu. To find out more about the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars, please visit istc.illinois.edu/events. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. You can download the slides in the handout section of the GoToWebinar toolbar. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available for viewing online in about a week. I'll be sending an email out to everyone who registered for the webinar once those are available. Everyone will remain muted for the entire webinar. You can type in your questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar at any time. The speaker will pause several times throughout the presentation to answer questions. During those times, I'll be reading the questions that you type in to the speaker. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Mark Rossi. Mark is the Executive Director for Clean Production Action, or CPA. CPA's main mission is to design and deliver strategic solutions for green chemicals, sustainable materials, and environmentally preferable products. Mark has been a part of the CPA team since 2004 in various roles and became Executive Director in 2016. Since 2004, Mark has led several projects with CPA, including being co-creator of Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, a globally recognized chemical hazard assessment method used by governments and businesses in the electronics, apparel, and building sectors to identify safer alternatives to toxic chemicals. In 2017, Mark led CPA's launch of Green Screen Certified, a certification program for products that meet the rigorous Green Screen criteria. He co-founded the Chemical Footprint Project, a first-of-its-kind innovative method to quantitatively measure chemical footprints and allow manufacturers and retailers to benchmark and communicate their progress in chemicals management performance and reduce potentially hazardous chemicals relative to industry peers. He also founded BizNGO, a collaboration of businesses, NGOs, and governments that work together to create solutions for safer chemicals and sustainable materials. He's a member of the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Act Advisory Committee and has received several awards and honors for his work in the toxic reduction area. So Mark, thank you for joining us, and the webinar is yours.
Hi, Beth, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today and to present on some of the tools that we've developed at Clean Production Action. As Beth said, I'm the Executive Director at Clean Production Action and have been on the journey with CPA and prior to that with the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Institute and a PhD program at MIT, and how to really think about this transition from chemicals of concern to human health and the environment to safer solutions. Let's see, there we go. So just thinking about the journey that organizations are on around safer alternatives, and it really, where I come at this work from is that we need to dramatically reduce the risks, right, the adverse human health and environmental effects of toxic chemicals. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail around that. But one of the challenges, and we work a lot with companies, but also with governments, as well as advocacy organizations, is that preventing the exposure to hazardous chemicals is really challenging, right? Making substitutions and identifying inherently safer alternatives is a challenging task for organizations, right? The chemicals are embedded into the products, into the materials, they provide performance, they meet cost requirements, right? So there's a lot of challenges to on this journey. And so what Clean Production Action has been doing since our founding in 2001 is really creating solutions to hazardous chemicals. And as Beth walked you through the different initiatives at a high level, I'm going to dive into detail in a couple of them. But what we really are trying to do with our tools is to simplify the complexity of toxicity for organizations, right? To create frameworks that they can use in practice. And today, I'm going to take you on this journey from chemicals to products to organizations, and thinking about and highlighting how organizations, how along each of those sort of pathways, organizations are taking steps to identify safer solutions to hazardous chemicals. So here's the outline. I'm going to give you a little intro to Clean Production Action. I just was going to touch on some key trends and some of the hazardous characteristics of chemicals, why there's a need for thinking about safer alternatives, and then dive into the set of hazard-based tools to reduce risks. Okay, so Clean Production Action, as Beth mentioned, our mission is to design and deliver strategic solutions for safer chemicals, sustainable materials, environmentally preferable products. And we do this work through collaborations and tools. So here on my left, I guess it's your left as well, as Beth mentioned, is BizNGO, collaboration of businesses and advocacy organizations working together on safer chemicals and sustainable materials. We also work with investors through an initiative called the Investor Environmental Health Network that brings together investors that are interested in socially responsible initiatives, as well as environmental social governance initiatives, to engage companies and where they're at on their journey to safer chemicals. And then today, I'm going to do a deeper dive into our two tools, Green Screen and the Chemical Footprint Project. So before I dive into my presentation, I just wanted to see, Beth and I are going to do a little poll with you. I just wanted to see what your understanding of different chemicals are. And so so there's a poll open. Beth, do you need to do any explanation about how to participate in the poll?
Nope. You can just click as many options as you've heard of before. And then the poll will run for about a minute, maybe a little less time, and I'll let you know when the poll's closing.
Right, so I wanted to, this was the longer list. We were only allowed to ask you 5. I think we were only allowed to have 5, so we shortened the list from what I have on the screen. But just wanted to see, what your understanding of some of these chemistries are, to the extent that you've heard of them in your daily life. And we'll just give you a minute to fill in the poll. Let's see. Do I need to click on anything, Beth?
Nope. We got maybe 10 seconds left, so if you haven't voted yet, now's the time. And the poll is closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I've shared it, so everyone can see.
Oh, let's see. Can I see? Where do I?
Looks like 73% of the audience has heard of bisphenol A, brominated flame retardants, and phthalates. And 100% of the audience has heard of lead, and only 64% of the audience has heard of PFAS, perfluorinated substances.
So thank you for that. Thanks for participating. So I expect everyone would know about lead, right? It's been around for a long, long time and of concern. Bisphenol A, many of you may have heard of BPA, like the BPA in baby bottles, BPA in water bottles. And I'll talk more about what are some of the concerns around BPA. Phthalates are commonly used in PVC plastic to make rigid PVC flexible and pliable. So any type of like vinyl fluorine would be an example of that. Vinyl gloves all have had phthalates in them. There's some changes in those chemistries over time. And I certainly will be coming into the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that otherwise known as PFAS or PFAS. And they are a subset of the organohalogens, right? So the halogenated chemistries are bromine, chlorine, fluorine, iodine, and then you have the carbon attached to the brominated chemicals make organohalogens. And there's been a lot of concern around organohalogens. So brominated flame retardants and PFAS are all subsets of organohalogens. This next slide, so I pulled some of these key highlights around the concerns around chemistry that are in this report that was released in 2019 by the United Nations Environment Program called the UN Global Chemicals Outlook 2. And this is an excellent report in terms of just providing a comprehensive look at chemicals globally and in terms of its problems, as well. There are problems with hazardous chemicals, as well as solutions from a policy angle, as well as from a corporate chemicals management angle. But so I just pulled out some key highlights around the concerns around chemicals. One is it's a huge industry. It's a $5 trillion industry. Of course, it's global. You've got this emergence of chemical-intensive products, and complex global supply chains create challenges for circularity, right? That's for closing loops. But right, the increasing concerns around chemicals and products, as opposed to chemicals in manufacturing. And I know many of you are working with companies and probably have worked with companies over the years about helping them to optimize their manufacturing processes and reduce waste from those processes. So there's historically been a lot of concern around chemicals used in manufacturing, and emitted into the environment. There's been this switch over to concerns around the chemicals that are actually in the products and then exposing users or causing challenges at the end of life. Just going to bounce around here a little bit. You can see all of these, but chemical pollutants are ubiquitous in the environment and in humans. So if we tested all of us, we probably all would have many of those chemicals that were on the prior page. We would have bisphenol A, phthalates, certainly PFAS. Basically everybody in the US has PFAS chemicals in there, and I'll come back to that chemistry. So we're all getting exposed. We have these chemicals in our bodies. Then, of course, what are those impacts, right? And the burden of disease from chemicals is high, especially for vulnerable populations. And a report by the World Health Organization estimated 1.6 million deaths related to exposures to chemicals, hazardous chemicals. So this is just a big picture frame. It's an excellent report to check out. Sort of diving into some of the emerging concerns around chemicals and hazardous chemicals. I was just going to pop up a few of these issues that are pretty hot these days in the environmental health and human health research areas. So one is endocrine disrupting compounds. Like if we were all in a room together, I would ask all of you to say how many of you have heard of this term. There's an excellent book that's on the market, Sicker, Poorer, Fatter by Dr. Tresandi. So that's something to check out, with summarizing a lot of the data up to the point that was published in 2019, making it accessible. And he was part of also a recent report that was released in 2020 that reviewed hundreds of studies on endocrine disrupting compounds. And there's this growing evidence. So the endocrine disruptors are getting into the body, and it's getting into the endocrine system. And there are very small amounts of chemicals matter because in the endocrine system, chemicals are used to signal cells to turn off and turn on different functions and different developmental functions. So one of the really concerns around endocrine disrupting compounds is small amounts of chemicals really matter. And these chemicals like bisphenol A and phthalates like diethyl hexylphthalate can get in there and muck up the signals in the endocrine system, right? So you see many of these chemicals that were on the prior slide, PFAS, phthalates, bisphenols, organophosphate, pesticides, and the brominated flame retardants. And you see these adverse effects like contributing to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, IQ loss, intellectual disability, infertility, reduced swimming quality, and cancer. So endocrine disrupting compounds can accelerate pre-existing conditions and also can increase the ability of the causes of these different adverse health effects. And so this is why endocrine disrupting compounds have become such a significant concern. There was just a new book that was released this week by Dr. Swan from Mount Sinai Medical Center, where she has done a lot of research around declining sperm counts and what those declining sperm counts, what's causing them. And this is a study. I forgot to put out the full citation for this, but this was a report that we released called the Chemical Footprint Project in 2019. And here you see this documentation in Western countries of a decline in sperm counts of 59%, essentially right 60% from 1970 to 2010. And there's a lot of concern that the endocrine disrupting compounds are a significant cause of this declining sperm count. So right, another adverse health effect. I mean, probably many of you have known couples that have had challenges getting pregnant, and certainly have needed fertility treatments, right? This is part of that cause of that. The other, so turning to PFAS chemicals have become a huge issue because they're incredibly persistent. Like essentially, they just don't break down. So that, so for PFAS, think of Teflon, think of Gore-Tex. Those are examples of perfluorinated chemistries. And you'll find PFAS chemicals in many, many different products. They're used as lubricants, right? They're they're durable water repellents. They are used in staining for anti-staining applications, oil and grease resistance. They've been commonly used in firefighting foam, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Biodegradable food serviceware, they were put into those products. So many different products, they're very persistent. Once out in the environment, they essentially don't break down. They do represent a class of chemicals of almost 5,000 chemicals. Some say even more than that. There's a great resource on PFAS chemicals at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. So I just put this up here. They've got a portal on PFAS chemistries. Another concern with the PFAS chemistries is that they are mobile. So when they get into the environment, they move through, especially like the soil, they will move through the soil and end up in groundwater and contaminate drinking water. So PFAS chemistries are a major source of groundwater contamination. In every state and probably in every country across the globe, you're finding PFAS chemicals in groundwater and drinking water. And this is one of the issues, and I'll talk about this around firefighting foams, but foams that have been sprayed to put out fires, especially at training facilities. They use PFAS in those foams. It goes into the ground and then makes its way through the soil to contaminate drinking water. And so now there's been a lot of concern around persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals. And now many scientists are thinking of mobility as an equivalent level of concern, right? So if you have something that's very persistent and very mobile, that this should be considered of equal concern as very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances. So this is just a flag that you're going to see more of. And in fact, the European Union has established in its recent chemical strategy a commitment to reducing non-essential uses of PFAS substances. So there's, starting in Europe, a significant amount of work happening. And there's been some legislation passed here in the US to ban PFAS in products like firefighting foam and food serviceware. And so, yeah, right, so I've highlighted many of these issues around the PFAS substances. So this is a class of chemicals that's wide. It's, as I mentioned, it's over approximately 5,000 substances. And as companies look into this and look into especially like compliance with state, federal, and global regulations, this is an emerging concern. So as you're working with businesses, this is something you may want to be asking about. And then like just, there's also this broader movement starting with the advocacy community and extending now to governments in terms of taking action on chemical classes. And the concern has been that you go from one form of a chemical in a class, like within the PFAS substances, there's PFOS, which is a specific chemical within the PFAS family. So you substitute from PFOS to PFOA to other perfluorinated chemistries. So it's constantly, just making a little tweak in the chemistry that, because regulations are lagging indicators, right? It takes a while for regulators to catch up to that. And so there's this growing movement to really think about chemicals within a class as problematic unless proven otherwise. So once a chemical in a class is proven to be harmful, there's growing movement that the other chemicals, even if there isn't data, should be considered of equivalent concern until proven differently. And I've just highlighted here a number of these different classes. I highlighted a bunch of them before, bisphenols, alkaphenol and alkaphenol ethoxylates, the phthalates. Siloxanes is another one. That's a class that would be a potential alternative to the PFAS substances. Certain chlorinated organic solvents would be another class of chemicals like methylene chloride. So this is this growing movement about like, how do you get ahead from a chemicals management perspective from the creativity of chemical manufacturers to make small tweaks in molecular design that moves the chemical out of the regulatory environment, but may have equivalent concerns. And thinking about these regulations, this has always been a fascinating chart for me. This takes a look at environmental regulations. And here at the bottom, you can see it's batteries, climate change, packaging, product safety, energy, waste, and substances. Looking across the globe, and each year is additive to the next year. But the red-orange bar there is substances, both chemical and material substances that have been regulated globally. And you can just see, over time and year over year, there's many more regulations that have been associated with chemical substances and materials than any other area in terms of environmental regulations. So this is just a flag of like this level of concern around hazardous chemicals and what businesses need to be doing in terms of managing them. And so regulations are a major driver for this pivot that I'm going to make in my presentation to the tools, market demands and financial risk. And I know I have to keep moving. So there are slides that I'm going to jump over because I over-prepared the slide deck today, but I'll just want to pause here and Beth, see if anybody had any questions along the way. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. Any questions?
No questions at this time. There's a Q&A feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which you can use to type in questions, and then I will read those to Mark. So I'd say we can continue on, and then if I see any, I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so turning to tools. So our focus at Clean Production Action is on prevention, pollution prevention, toxic use reduction, right? And all of our tools are based on taking a look at the inherent hazards of chemicals and reducing them in the first place. So, so risk assessment, right, is the dominant chemicals management and regulatory.
We did have one pop in, Mark.
Sure, go for it, Beth.
Is there a category of chemicals that you think has not received enough attention?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, going back, so what's happening is there's categories that I just put up on the previous slide, which I could go back to that. These categories of chemicals, when we look across them, metals and their compounds have generally been the most widely regulated and addressed. Although you still have, right, lead is commonly used in many products, but like all of you are familiar with lead. So I would say metals, right, are generally well addressed. Certainly they can be, there's opportunities for improvement. But then you get to these new areas like PFAS, is an area that is totally emerging. I would say the bisphenols are also very complicated chemistries and how to address and manage those. So those are more of the ones that are, I would say, that are at the cutting edge. So if you have metals on one end as being pretty well managed, and then you've got PFAS and bisphenols as being new classes that are emerging, and then these others that are somewhere in between in terms of how well they're being managed.
And we had one more come in. Are there any particular classes of end uses that are especially problematic?
Yes, so it's been the end uses where you're likely, well, two parts of this. One where you're likely to have an exposure during use. So an example of that is the phthalates in PVC, because the phthalates oftentimes are not reacted into the polymer and they peel off and expose us in our homes. Formaldehyde is another one that is used in products that comes off and exposes people. So one is, are the chemicals likely to be exposed in use? And increasingly, if it's persistent, those chemicals are going to be a problem because of the circularity issue, right? As we try and tighten up material loops, anything that's very persistent is going to be causing problems because it's always going to be present and able to be released into the environment. And once in the environment, it's going to cause a problem. So these substances that are persistent or break down into very persistent compounds are problematic. And those are like the organohalogens. So I didn't zoom into some specific uses there, but they're just at a high level how to think about those. So turning to tools, where I was at here is that, so this is risk assessment, right? Hazard times exposure equals risk. And the vast majority of our efforts to reduce risk has focused on reducing exposure, right? Using personal protective equipment, that's PPE, engineering controls, right? Have a fan, have a way of separating out the material, using, right, air pollution control devices, water pollution control devices, right? All these different efforts to reduce that release into the environment or to the exposure of the worker. But the much more effective manner to reduce the risk of a hazardous chemical is to eliminate that chemical in the first place, right? So eliminating the use of a chemical is going to be much more effective than efforts at reducing exposure. So like all of the work of Clean Production Action is centered on this focus of like, how do we reduce the hazards of chemicals by identifying safer alternatives to hazardous chemicals. And so we have created a family of chemical hazard-based tools looking at specifically chemicals. And I use these as examples of the methodologies as I go through these tools that I'm going to be talking to you about today. I use them as examples of methodologies of how you design tools to address hazard. So it's a way of thinking of those, even though we've got these specific tools at Clean Production Action, they all can be, these approaches can be generic, and other tools are out there and can be equally effective. So I just wanted to flag that. So one, you have green screen, which is a chemical hazard assessment method. And I'm going to come back to what green screen does, but this is the evaluation of an individual chemical and doing that hazard assessment part of it to identify, is it of concern or not. We also created a tool that is really easy to use called Green Screen List Translator, which is essentially a preliminary chemical hazard assessment, right, to see if this chemical has been put on an authoritative or screening list, but like authoritative government list would be like the US EPA's persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemical list, the EPA PBT list, for example, or California Proposition 65 carcinogens and reproductive toxicants. And then from both that chemical hazard assessment and the list translator, we created a product certification, which I'm going to walk you through each one of these tools, but these are different ways of how do you take this idea, let's eliminate the hazard by eliminating the use of the chemical, so like bisphenol A. How do I do that? How do I then identify safer solutions? So when we do a green screen hazard assessment, we're looking at 18 different endpoints, from cancer, reproductive toxicity, endocrine activity, to neurotoxicity and skin sensitization, to ecotox, persistent bioaccumulation, to reactivity, inflammability. So there's 18 different endpoints, which encompasses our hazard assessment. As you can imagine, this is like to try and answer this question, right? So for bisphenol A, to do a full hazard assessment, you would have to go and look at it for all these different 18 endpoints. I'll say a little bit more about that. But we take those 18 different endpoints and roll them up into a set of benchmark scores. And with benchmark 1, right, being avoid, chemical of high concern, and 4 being prefer safer chemical. Getting to 4 is really hard for a chemical. I mean, you have to be like water because you have to be low on all those other 18 endpoints. So most chemicals, a lot of chemicals do end up being, benchmark 1, 2, or 3 because they have some form of an adverse health effect associated with them. But the power of this framework is once you get all the data, highlight some of the challenges of getting that data, but once you have the data, if this was an assessment, we were looking at alternatives to methylene chloride, which is used in paint strippers and solvents. And we were saying, well, what would be a safer alternative? So methylene chloride is benchmark 1. These are common chemicals found in paint strippers and solvents. And it gives you a readily available assessment of like, okay, I want a safer alternative. Maybe I want to go with DMSO, for example, or one of these other, benchmark 2s. But now at least you have an understanding of how to make product selections. Now, gathering this data does require, toxicologists are the one that use and apply our tool because it's so comprehensive, but like this is all the data that underlines those prior endpoints. And so you've got each one of these columns is an endpoint, and then you've got these levels of high, moderates, and lows of concern for the different endpoints. And you can see as you look at this, you go like, all right, how do I make heads or tails of that? That's why the benchmarking framework really helps to clarify and simplify that process of assessing a chemical. Now, we do have organizations that have taken on this task of looking at safer alternatives. So TCO Certified is a certification for electronics products. It's a sustainability standard. And they have been looking at brominated flame retardants, which are used in electronic devices, and as well as plasticizers. So over here, this type column, it says FR, that's flame retardant, PL is plasticizer. And they've been looking and identifying safer alternatives in flame retardants and plasticizers. And this is a longer list. I just took a snapshot, but you could check it out at TCO Certified Accepted Substances List website. But this is an example of where they're guiding anybody that gets their certification can have a green screen benchmark 1 red chemical for flame retardants and plasticizers. And then they created this accepted substances list, which identifies anything that's a benchmark 2 or higher. And this is all designed so you don't have a regrettable substitute. So you've got DEHP, a phthalate that's a reproductive developmental toxicant endocrine disruptor, and you want to get out of DHP, but you will go to another one, you don't want to have a regrettable substitute. And that's where hazard assessment becomes really important. You've got a problematic chemical, I want an alternative, okay, is that alternative safer or not, as evaluated by an independent third party? And that's what Green Screen does as a hazard assessment tool, Green Screen for safer chemicals. And that's what any hazard assessment framework would do for you, right? It helps organizations identify safer solutions. The list translator is a quick shortcut to evaluate whether any chemical has been identified by authoritative bodies as problematic. So we take our Green Screen Benchmark 1 criteria. We look at lists like the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the European Union lists, US EPA lists, Prop 65, and then created a structure by which you can quickly identify whether a chemical is problematic. And you can go to either one of these websites, these companies, Toxnot and Pharos is a tool of the Healthy Building Network. And you can type in a chemical name and it'll pop up whether it's what level of concern there is with that chemistry. And it uses the Green Screen List Translator framework. So that's really simple and quick, right? Any one of us can go and do that. To do a full green screen assessment of all those 18 different endpoints is only something toxicologists can use. So doing a complete hazard assessment, while it provides much more data, is also more costly. So that's this trade-off. But this is an example. I don't know if any of you have heard of health product declarations, but it's a template for disclosing chemical ingredients in building products. So here we have an extruded aluminum louver from Industrial Louvers, Inc. So they went, so that company created this HPD, a health product declaration statement, and the nonprofit HPD has created this template that companies go and fill in, and they list all their chemical ingredients, very much like a food product. And then these gray boxes are their Green Screen List Translator scores. I don't have time today to get into all the details, but List Translator 1 is the equivalent of a benchmark 1 red chemical. LT1, P1 means it's potentially 1, and LT unknown means that it's on one of the lists, but it doesn't relate to our criteria, or in many cases, you may not have a green screen score associated with it at all. That's what NOGS is, no green screen score. But you can see there's a lot of unknowns, and that's because these chemicals haven't been assessed. And that's one of the challenges is for many chemicals, you don't have complete data sets available for them. And then you have to go and hire a toxicologist to pull that together for you on your own. So just a little bit on the types of end users of green screen, on the right-hand side here, these are electronics organizations, EP and TCR standards, HP and Apple, you would know. Green screen has been used in the apparel sector, the building products sector, and state governments in terms of evaluating safer alternatives. So it's pretty widely used. I mean, there's other hazard assessment frameworks, but this is just to give you a sense of this. Our whole methodology and framework is freely available on our website for greenscreenchemicals.org. You can go and grab that report there. But just to summarize, right, hazard assessment, we've identified 18 different endpoints, right? And then we specified levels of concern within each endpoint. So for cancer, is it high, moderate, or low? And criteria for each level for each endpoint. So you can get that big hazard summary table that I showed before with all those letters on it. What we then do, and what is sort of unique in what Green Screen uniquely does, is to roll up those endpoints into these tiers, right, from benchmark 1 red to benchmark 4 green. And those are definitely value judgments that we made as an organization. I could certainly say more there. So I was going to turn to Q&A. Any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple that came in.
Great.
What about cross reaction due to exposure to a mixture of chemicals?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So and you can have two different sort of scenarios on that. One, right, you've got a mixture of chemicals that would cause a unique adverse effect, and the challenge there is right, there's just so little data on mixtures and their adverse health effects, right? So it's potential, right? If you mix them together, you're going to get an adverse effect that you otherwise wouldn't. And we would not, that's true, we would not capture that. And it's really hard to get that data, right? So that means that every product would have to have that level of testing, right? 18 different endpoints. So it's really hard to do that until the point, unless you had some, like, rules where you've identified, we know that if we mix these types of chemicals together, you're more likely to get that adverse effect. It's a real challenge. Mixtures are a real challenge, in short, and that's correct. We don't address mixtures. Is there anything else, Beth?
Yeah, someone was asking for the link to be added to the chat. So I've just sent that now. Also a reminder that you can download the slides in the handouts section in the GoToWebinar toolbar. And the video and slides will be available online in about a week. And then another question popped through. For organic compounds, are there chemical functions which are known to be more hazardous than others, such as halogenated compounds?
Well, let's see. So there's, so the halogenated compounds have been a challenge. I mean, I think, like, on terms of functions, there's been the flame retardants and plasticizers, surfactants, solvents, right? Those functions have had hazardous chemicals associated with them. I mean, they don't always have to be hazardous per se, right? Like, so water is a great solvent. But in terms of toxicity concerns, like, those categories have been the ones of really great concern, and especially, then another functional use of concern has been the durable water repellents and water repellency stain resistance, which have been really associated with the PFAS chemistries, are among the functional uses where you've seen a lot of concerns. I'm just going to motor along here. I'm going to give you a flavor of hazard assessment in products, and then also in organizations. So when we created Greenscreen, that was back in 2007, Greenscreen Chemical for Safer Chemicals, Chemical Hazard Assessment Method. Early on, organizations were saying, well, yeah, we know that this issue with individual chemicals, but we use these products with many chemicals in them. And how can we evaluate the chemistry of a product? So that was always a question that had been asked of us since we launched Greenscreen in 2007. So in 2017, we launched a product certification system. And I'm going to walk you through this example around firefighting foam pretty quickly. But and the advantage here is that the issue with firefighting foam has been the use of PFAS substances in the firefighting foam. And so then it's like, well, okay, what's a safer alternative to PFAS and firefighting foam, right? So that was the question. And firefighting foam is a mixture. So we've now go and create product certifications that integrate this hazard-based framework into product assessment. And there's 4 key parts that we have of these product certifications. So 1 is chemical inventory, 2 is a restricted substance list, 3 is the chemical hazard assessment, just what I was talking about previously with Greenscreen assessments and List Translator, and the elimination of those chemicals of concern, and analytic testing. So these have been 4 key parts of our product certification, where we go and look at the integration of a hazard-based framework in terms of evaluating a product. To the earlier point, we don't evaluate the whole product generally as a mixture, but there are exceptions. One of the reasons we've created this is because purchasers, firefighters, for example, like the different cities, so like airports all use PFAS firefighting foam, right? So O'Hare has on-site PFAS firefighting foams, right? They're not chemists, right? So they're not going to be able to evaluate, well, if I have a PFAS-free foam, is that from PFAS-free and is it safer? Like, how do I know that? So what we've created is Greenscreen Certified to help simplify that communication between purchasers and manufacturers. Purchasers wanting products with safer chemistries, manufacturers saying that their products have safer chemistries. How do you know that's true? And so Greenscreen Certified helps to facilitate that communication. Okay, so Greenscreen Certified for firefighting foam. I have a list up here of the peer reviewers that peer review the certification. But one of the challenges with products, even in a manufacturing operation of a product that comes into the facility, is frequently organizations don't know everything that's in that product. So if you get a safety data sheet, it only has certain of those chemicals that are listed. It doesn't have a complete list of all the chemicals that are intentionally added in the products. So to get certification, a company has to disclose all the chemicals in the products. It has to meet the restricted substance list. This is a repetition of what I just said. So disclosure, all intentionally added substances have to be disclosed, and all impurities greater than 100 ppm. So this is something that this disclosure part is disclosed. Clean Production Action gets the data, and it's under a non-disclosure agreement. So we can't share that information, but at least we can evaluate it to our framework. We have a set of restricted substances list, these classes of chemicals, so no PFAS, for example, no other organohalogens. We do require some analytic testing for acute aquatic toxicity and total organic fluorine. And this is an example, though, where we do get at a bit of the potential hazard of a mixture. So this is the whole product as sold, then has to pass specific acute aquatic toxicity testing requirements. And that is one where we do look at the criteria, look at the product as a whole and its potential for adverse effects. And this is because, right, you're using a firefighting foam it's dispersed in the environment, it's going to it could get into the water, right? And so we want to be protective of the aquatic environment. We do require that they demonstrate that it's, as we would say, PFAS free, but PFAS free is less than 1 ppm total organic fluorine. So that's a requirement that they would have to meet. So they have to send their product to independent laboratories for organic fluorine and acute aquatic ecotoxicity testing. And then we currently have 10 products that have been certified to our criteria. That's all available up on our website. And we're creating the structure to say that it's PFAS free, less than 1 ppm, and also avoids many hazardous chemicals. This is a summary of all the criteria. Don't have time to sort of highlight this, but I just walked you sort of through the key points of that. So that was, but the framework here is what we're doing is the companies have to disclose, so these manufacturers of firefighting foam have to disclose all the chemical ingredients to us and impurities greater than 100 parts per million. And then they have to meet specific requirements around not having PFAS, not having any green screen list translator 1 chemicals in there. And we have different levels of certification. So you can see that these are all bronze. It's more challenging to get to silver and gold. But then we have more rigorous requirements about the level of evaluation of the chemicals to get to the next level. Any questions on?
One of our viewers wanted to clarify their question, that last one that I asked. They were intending chemical functional groups. So they're asking what chemical functional groups to avoid when synthesizing safer chemicals.
Well, certainly the organohalogens is one of those. And since I'm not a chemist, the breakdown of the other ones, like there's the orthophthalates are a class. Let's see, I could go, oh no, sorry, I was trying to get back to the slide with all the chemical classes, but there's the siloxanes, but it's not the whole class of siloxanes. Let's see, can I get back here? Sorry, just give me a minute. Right up here. Yeah, so these classes of chemicals, so you've got the orthophthalates, the organohalogens, the siloxanes, the cyclic volatile methyl siloxanes are all specific classes. You've got the azodies, which are another functional class, and you've got the alkophenols and alkophenol oxalates are all in that category. Hopefully that's helpful. Lastly, I know we're getting short on time, but we've also spent a lot of time thinking about, like, well, how do you take this hazard-based, preventive-based framework and look at where organizations are at in addressing it? So all that detail that I was just presenting around chemical hazard assessment and chemical hazards and products requires a lot of work on the part of organizations, right? Just getting the chemical inventory, what are all the chemicals that are in the product by homogeneous material, is a humongous amount of work. We find that most organizations do not know all the chemicals that are intentionally added to their products because their suppliers hold certain information back under non-disclosure, hold information back under confidential business information. And so there's a lot of work that must go on to go and extract that information from the supply chain, for example. And so what we did over the years was we looked at best practices in companies in terms of chemicals management with the goal of eliminating chemicals of high concern to human health and the environment. And this was a journey we began at BizNGO starting back in 2006. And we now have something called the Chemical Footprint Project Survey, where we evaluate companies in terms of their management strategy, their chemical inventory. So that's right, what do they know about chemicals in their products and supply chains? Footprint measurement, can they measure their use of chemicals of high concern? Do they have initiatives to reduce them? And then what do they disclose, and are their answers verified? And we love this mountain climbing analogy because it's a challenge. And of course, there's many peaks to summit, so it's a constant challenge that iterates over time. And so we created the Chemical Footprint Project Survey. It's 100 points spread across these four different pillars. But it really does create a holistic framework for chemicals management based on a hazard-based approach. So because you can see, like, we have 20 points for management strategy, there's 4 questions, but within each question, there's a number of different potential actions. So overall, I think this adds up to 80 plus different types of actions that organizations can be taking in terms of to get to the high points, to scoring 100 points in this survey. And so what it does is it creates this framework both for internal benchmarking as well as communicating to stakeholders. So with the survey, we have been working with investors and purchasers who are really interested in where either the companies they invest in or the companies they buy from, what are they doing to use to address chemicals holistically? What's that organization doing? So you can see this list, but there's investors with over $2 trillion in assets, purchasers with $800 billion in purchasing power. Here's all the participants in this year's study from apparel, building products, electronics, household and personal products, medical, retail, toys. So a number of organizations from different sectors have participated. And what this diagram is here is each one of these bars is one of the companies and its scoring. And you can think of this as a framework to create a set of benchmarks of performance, right? So where is my organization at on its journey? So by the way, all these questions and everything is on chemicalfootprint.org, and you can go and download the survey. I think, like, for organizations to understand organizationally where companies are on their journey, it's a really powerful framework. But this 32% are new responders that just started participating in the survey. I'm going to just sort of zip through these slides here. This is returning responders. These are companies that participated in more than 1 year. They averaged 54%. And again, each one of these color coding represents your journey on the pillars. And you can see that disclosure and verification is really the thing that companies typically do the least of. So as you get in the lower scoring companies, right, they're not doing much disclosure and verification. And that the disclosure is, what are you sharing about your journey publicly? And there's a real reluctance to do that. And this is all, again, beyond compliance. So our baseline is regulatory compliance. And so this is like, where is an organization at in its journey beyond compliance? And at the top, and this is pretty interesting, our front runners were a mix of companies, beauty counters, personal care products company, Herman Miller Furniture, HP Electronics, Human Scale, Naturepedic are both in the building products sector. Reckitt Benckiser and Seventh Generation are household products companies. And I know I am at time, but what you get is, right, you can benchmark yourself. If you worked with a company to fill out the survey, you could see where that company is at in terms of its overall progress, as well as its opportunity for improvement. So it's a very powerful tool for understanding how well are your systems as an organization in terms of chemicals management in a beyond compliance framework, right? How well are you positioned for what consumers and large purchasers like healthcare organizations, and if you're a publicly traded company, right, what investors are caring about? I'm going to wrap that up here, Beth, and just see if there are any other questions, and I can pick those up quickly here at the end.
Sure. Concerning effectiveness, do the safer firefighting foams work according to firefighters?
That's a really great question, and the answer is generally yes in terms of performance. There's, a lot of firefighters are now just train only on PFAS-free foams, right? Because they don't want the exposure. And in other, so here in the U.S., for example, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, requires the use of foams that contain PFAS. So for airports, for example, you can't use anything but PFAS-containing foams. But in other countries where they've lifted that requirement, like Australia, is almost all PFAS-free foams. Many European airports, for example, are going PFAS-free, as are in Canada. So on the ground, PFAS-free foams are being used in other countries in real firefighting foam situations, and they perform as well.
Do you generally test cleaner alternatives for performance?
No, that's a great question. No, that is not our expertise. So we're starting to highlight the different standards, for example, that the firefighting foam products meet, the PFAS-free ones to that point. But that we have not been testing performance because it isn't our expertise. We see that as the role more for purchasers who have much greater expertise in that space, right? Firefighters know the performance part, right? And they're going to want to test that. We can do the chemistry evaluation.
Do you provide feedback on different products, on the safer products from anyone?
Do we provide feedback?
Like product reviews or links to where they can find those things?
We're looking to make sure that I don't think it's currently there on our website for firefighting foam, but we would provide the links to the specific products that the companies put up on their website. But we haven't provided, it's a good question, we haven't provided specific links to other reviews of those products in terms of performance. We do collect that information and point people, like if you come to us directly, but we haven't been providing that up on the website, for example.
I'll give a last call for questions. While we're waiting for the last call, I'll go ahead and plug my organization, the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, and the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant are hosting an Emerging Contaminants Conference in April. And that conference will be the latest research on many of the chemicals that Mark has mentioned in this presentation. So that conference focuses on current research, and I'll put the link to that conference in the chat. It's go.illinois.edu/ECEC21. And our final question is, do you provide alternative, safer list of organic solvents/chemicals in place of existing hazardous ones?
So the assessment we did on alternatives to methylene chloride is an example. And that person emailed me, I could send them that report. And so that's been our current, that's the most specific work we've done on those solvents. We are looking at other solvents, but we haven't published any of that work to date. So it's been, we looked at methylene, alternatives to methylene chloride in paint strippers and paints. That was that one assessment. And I can send that link to the person if they just send me an email, mark@cleanproduction.org, and I can send that to them.
Well, Mark, thank you for an excellent presentation. And what final thoughts would you like to leave us with?
Well, thank you, Beth. It's been great to be here. I just think, like, working with companies and even governments around how to integrate, a preventive-based framework into how they think about chemicals and products and manufacturing operations is the best way to prevent exposure to hazardous chemicals and to improve our health and the environment. So I just encourage you to think about different ways to do that. And if you ever are confronting problems or challenges on that work, just feel free to get in touch with myself or others at Clean Production Action. We're glad to just point you in a direction that helps you get answers.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Have a great afternoon, everyone.